Bulovinaka, and welcome to Gold FM's Speak Your Mind. I'm Peceli Rokotuivuna, your host for this session of this, afternoon show. And a very good afternoon to you on Gold FM and also to you tuned in on FBC TV. This afternoon, as we know it, we've overheard on the news and also right here on Gold FM, the draft constitution. And with us this afternoon, thank you very much for joining us, the Attorney General of Fiji, Mr. Aiyaz Sayed-Khaiyum. A very good afternoon to you, sir.
Good afternoon, Peceli. Thank you for having us.
And thank you for taking the time. I believe it's been a hectic schedule. It's been, we've been hearing of the team being in Tavua, in Vunualebu. So, obviously, I'm going to ask, how has it been? How has the response been so far?
I think it's been actually very good. It's obviously been very interactive, very frank discussions. We've been, as you know, we had our first session in Suva, we were then in Lautoka, Ba, Nandi, Duvu in Nanronga, Tavyuni Sabu, and in Rishikul High School in Nasinu, and then we were yesterday in Kandavu, and then last night, requested by the people of Solomon Island descent, we went down to their community in Wailuku last night. Today we'll be in Tavua upon the request of Tui Tavua, and then on Saturday we are in Naviti. On Naviti Island, I should say, in the Yasavas.
Okay.
And then on Monday in Rakiraki, and then Tuesday in Vunindawa.
That's quite a bit of a schedule and quite a bit of distance to cover. But I believe that, again, for those who are listening in this afternoon, you're most welcome to call us in, 3220-906, with your comments. Of course, this is for delayed coverage on FBC TV. Now, we also have our emails available on goldfm at fbc.com.fj. We will be touching shortly on these questions. Now, Mr. Attorney General, could you just tell us what would be what has been the topic that has been raised the most?
Okay, there's been a number of those. For example, you have the people asking questions about security of land ownership, and then that's number one. People ask about things like what are the implications of the unfair discrimination provisions, questions on non-discrimination on sexual orientation regarding homosexuality. But predominantly the number of questions has been on education, regarding religious freedom, what does secular state mean. But I think overwhelmingly what people talk about, apart from the politicians, of course, the socioeconomic rights. For example, yesterday in Kandavu, we had a lot of people asking about the implications of the right to economic participation, for example, and the right to work. How will that be implemented? What does it mean in practical terms? Last night, for example, we had questions being asked about right of access to social welfare. A lot of people of Solomon Island descent feel that they have been marginalized for decades. For example, the classification initially amongst what they then used to call the Fijian voters, but then after 87 they were classified as others. But most of the problems are to do with socioeconomic issues, access to, for example, we had an issue regarding access to FNPF funds to build homes. Because they are not classified where they live as a village, therefore they don't get the funding to build homes. So there are those sorts of issues. And a lot of people, for example, talk about the access to, everyday issues.
Yeah.
How will that be addressed? And the point that I try and make is that in the socioeconomic rights, for the first time you'll have socioeconomic rights in a constitution, a Fijian constitution. The only sort of socioeconomic right that we had previously in the 1997 Constitution was the right to education. But it said everyone had a right to basic education. This right, in fact, talks about a right to education in primary, early childhood, secondary, and further education, and also the obligation on the state to progressively provide free education in all of those four areas. We had, for example, people also question on the right of speech, the limitations of it. So, we can go into details about that, but there were some of the issues that were talked about.
Right. Well, we will be touching most definitely on this because these are some of the issues that have also been raised by our listeners on the station, and I'm sure for many. Now, this has come, I'm sure, with you when you have traversed the nation. The explanatory notes on the draft constitution. There have been a lot of questions. Will it be available, and when will it be published?
Well, in fact, we were going to publish the explanatory notes, but because we are now going around the countryside, and because we've had, for example, the Prime Minister on Talkback Radio, and because there have been other programs, outreach programs, where people are actually going around and explaining what's within the Constitution and the rationale and the principles behind it, and that has not been done because it would have also required quite a bit of time. But definitely, if you look at the provision in the draft Constitution, there is a requirement that the Constitution, once finalized, needs to be published in the vernacular.
That's right.
In the vernacular languages. So that is being done. But to answer your question, no, there was an English version done, but there has, because we ran out of time and because we could not get it translated. And therefore, we then also, as you know, there's outreach programs that we are having at the moment. Initially, it was only designed to target the ROCOs, the provincial administrators, the rural advisory councillors, so they can sort of take out the message and explain to people if they get asked questions on it. But then we've opened it up to the public.
That's right.
And that's the approach that has been taken.
Well, there's also, now we will touch on, is the Bill of Rights of the 2013 Fiji Draft Constitution, as it's been considered to be an improvement of past constitutions. We've also had listeners and also viewers on FBC TV who've been sending in emails with saying that, okay, there are limitations on the rights mentioned within it, and we're just asking, okay, if there were or if there is, could you just explain a little bit more about?
Sure. I mean, most rights have limitations, and the limitations that you see included, for example, in the civil and political rights, that's where the limitations are. Those limitations were already in the 1997 Constitution, so there's nothing new. Yes, there are one or two new ones. For example, in the areas pertaining to political participation, where there's restrictions in respect of your ability to, for example, stand as a candidate. So if you're, for example, the president of the Fiji Employees Federation, you can also be a candidate for elections. In the same way, if you're a general secretary of a trade union organization, you can't be general secretary and also be standing for elections. You have to resign from you have to resign from the general secretary position to be nominated as a candidate.
Obviously. Well, we will touch a little bit more on this, and we'll head into a short break.
Sure.
But you're most welcome to do call us up with your questions and clarifications with regards to the draft constitution. This is Speak Your Mind with Peceli. Welcome back to Speak Your Mind on Gold FM with our guest, the Attorney General, and we're talking about the draft constitution, Fiji's draft constitution, and also with the teams from the Attorney General's office heading out to the various parts of Fiji to talk more about this. And we thank the Attorney General for making the time to also stop and clarify a few things that have been raised in the media, and also with that you may have a question with regards to the draft constitution. Now, Mr. Aiyaz Sayed-Khaiyum, I have something this is something that we deal with in the media. The freedom of expression in the draft constitution. A lot have been said about this. And of course, with the limitations. Would you like to just clarify a little bit more on this?
Sure. Peceli, for the draft constitution, if you look at section 17, which is freedom of expression, publication in the media, we've included the bulk of it. The rewording has come from Yashgai. So it says every person has a right to freedom of expression and publication, which includes freedom to seek, receive, and impart information, knowledge, and ideas. Freedom of the press, including print, electronic, and other media. Freedom of imagination, creativity, and academic freedom, and freedom of scientific research. It then goes on to say, which is directly from the guide draft, freedom of expression and publication does not protect propaganda for war. It does not protect incitement to violence or insurrection against this constitution. Obvious. Now, the rest of the limitations is borrowed verbatim from the 1997 Constitution. So it's nothing new. Okay. In fact, I note some of the people who are talking about it were quite happy with the 1997 Constitution, but suddenly they seem to have woken up to these limitations. The only exception there is under 3H, it says making provisions for the enforcement of media standards and providing for the regulation, registration, and conduct of media organizations. As you know, we have the Media Development Decree that's in place, and it provides certain guidelines. It provides, for example, rules pertaining to ownership, etc. So this is what it's there for. Now, the point that we've also been making is whichever parliament gets elected next year, after the elections are held no later than 30th September 2014, can get rid of the Media Development Decree if they want to. But what this proviso does is says, should there any be law in place or be made in the future, those provisos are there. Now, the limitation, there's always been a limitation to what you can publish or broadcast. Similarly, there's always been a limitation to what you can say. It's accepted both in common law and also in statute law, and also through limitations in the Constitution. So every media organization will tell you, they have training courses on this too, what you cannot publish or what you can't broadcast. So you can't, for example, say the Solicitor General, for example, is a liar unless you know he's actually a liar. Otherwise, he can sue you. In the same way, if you say we have freedom of speech, you can't go out and stand on the street or get a group of people together and say, let's go and kill, a group of people, or let's go and kill all the Chinese, whatever the case may be. I was asked a question in Nandi by one of the talatalas of one of the churches, and we were talking about the freedom of speech vis-a-vis homosexuality, because you see there's a provision in section 26.3 that says that you cannot unfairly discriminate against people based on a number of grounds. We've included some new grounds like culture, religion, marital status, and pregnancy, but also sexual orientation, which continues from the previous constitution. And in that, however, we clarified that it does not mean same-sex marriage. It's quite emphatically provided for in this constitution, in the draft constitution. You cannot discriminate against, for example, homosexuals and say, we don't give them jobs, or you tell them to go and sit at the back of the bus, or they can't go to particular restaurants or pubs, or cannot participate in the social, economic life of Fiji. But it does not mean that it allows for same-sex marriage, because what it says is that the law of marriage will prevail. The law of marriage in Fiji says that marriage is a union between a man and a woman. It's not a union between a man and a man, or a woman and a woman. So within that context, in the context of freedom of speech, he said, can I preach in my church that homosexuality is immoral? I said, yes, you can. Can I say that it's against the law of nature? Can I say it's against the teachings of the Bible? Absolutely. I mean, that's his belief and his freedom of religion, and he can preach that. But the moment he starts saying, let's go and kill all the homosexuals, or let's go and beat them up, that's where the limitation comes into effect. Because you're inciting hatred, you're inciting harm against a particular group of people. So there are some of the limitations that you have. And those limitations, of course, have been accepted throughout. And as I said, if anybody looks at these things closely, many of the limitations to these civil and political rights were already there in the 1997 Constitution.
All right. Well, would you also, we're just looking at some of the reports in international media with regards to the limitations on the media. And I think in the New Zealand Herald today, we're looking at some who have said that the media is gagged and held at gunpoint. And there's no freedom of the media at all. And everything is being controlled by the government. With response to this, would you like to just do you have any comments with regard to this?
Well, you see, this is a general trend. As we saw, for example, in one of the sessions in Nasino, there are a group of people who want to misrepresent facts in Fiji and misrepresent facts or the objectives of this draft constitution for their own political agendas. These people, I understand, have been given a free trip to New Zealand, paid for, I think, by the New Zealand government. They have a particular foreign policy agenda towards Fiji. So they're basically feeding into that frenzy. I mean, no media organization is held on the point of a gun. They're saying that the media is not free at all. There has not been a single prosecution since the Media Development Industry Decree came into place regarding any media organization being stopped from publishing anything. Nobody's been prosecuted. There is one prosecution at the moment on foot regarding ownership issues, but nothing to do with the editorial aspect of it. So how can they say there's control? They're essentially saying this so they can feel good, look good. They probably want to stand for elections. They want to perhaps cover themselves up for certain other things. So you see, I mean, the approach government has taken in this entire exercise has been that we've gone out to the public. There are obviously some people who strongly disagree with certain sections. There are some people who are trying to create a disquiet by saying that this constitution does not guarantee, for example, land ownership rights to the Itauke people. And notwithstanding the fact that we try and explain it, they sort of stand and grandstand, etc. That's fine. They can do that. If there is in fact restrictions on the ability to do that, they would not have been able to do that. And I understand it was also reported in the media, so how is the media gagged? But anyway, that's another issue. But my point is that we are taking this out to the public, and all we ask people to do is to objectively look at this. There are some worthwhile submissions that have been made, for example, in what we're talking about, the expropriation of land, that perhaps, yes, there is a need to enunciate, specifically spell out, when we say nobody can take away anybody's land without the consent, that people feel a lot more comfortable by putting in, saying, Itauke land or freehold land. So they are good suggestions. And those sort of suggestions are very constructive suggestions. They probably should be included in the draft. Right. So this is what we want. I mean, there are some people, for example, who are saying, well, there's a provision here that says that the commander-in-chief of the RFMF should be the elected prime minister, not the president. Some people feel strongly about that. There's some ex-military people who think that the president should continue to be the commander-in-chief. So we want to hear people's submission on that. What we go out and explain is the rationale.
All right.
The rationale is that we want to draw, given our history, a connectivity between the RFMF and the elected head of government. That's the rationale.
All right. On that note, we will take a break. This is Speak Your Mind on Gold FM. We have the Attorney General of Fiji talking about the draft constitution. We will be right back with more of your opinions. We'll be taking comments right after this break. Very good afternoon to you. You're on Speak Your Mind on Gold FM, and we have the Attorney General talking about the draft constitution on this afternoon's show. And, Attorney General, we'll go straight to the calls that have been coming in, and we have a caller. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, sir. You're on Speak Your Mind.
Hello, sir.
Bulamanaka, could you just state your name and where you're calling from?
Yes, I'm Israeli Mbolanivima, originally from the Eastern Division, currently residing on the Western Division, Lautoka.
Thank you very much. And your comments or your questions, please?
Yes, I have one comment first, then I will have two full questions to the Attorney General, sir.
All right, please proceed.
Thank you, sir. From the outset, Mr. Atir Singh, as well as Mr. Akilambaki from CCF, they came from different camps. However, from day one, they continue to sing the same tune concerning a national referendum to be taken in the formulation of our character constitution. Again, they continue to sing the same old tune, a referendum to be taken in the formulation of our constitution.
Sir, would you get to your question, please?
Sir, my question is this, sir. As aforementioned, with due respect to Mr. Singh and Mr. Mbaki, calling for a national referendum, is it right for me to say that this is a propaganda to stop and obstruct the election time frame come 2014, or this is all part of the political game in the name of politics? Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Okay, I believe that was just the comment. Would you like to?
Well, I think the gentleman makes a very, very valid point. And the point is that the Prime Minister, way back in July of 2009, set a time frame, and he made a commitment to hold the elections no later than 30th of September 2014. And this draft constitution provides for that. Mm-hmm. The caller refers to the Atar Singh and Reverend Aquila Yambaki. And we had a similar question by Atar Singh at that Nasinu forum we had. And he said, let's have a referendum. how are you going to have a referendum on this constitution? Are we going to put every single clause to the referendum and say to people, do you believe in Section 1 or Section 2? It's not as simple as that, because Section 2 has many subclauses. Are we going to get people to agree to every single subclause? We can be here for the next 3-4 years. Somebody may say, I may like half of Section 4, subsection 2, but I don't like the other half. I mean, how are we going to do that? I mean, his answer to that was, well, you're not an expert and I'm not an expert. We can get experts to help us to do that. But if you look at most constitutions in the world, when you formulate a new constitution, it's generally done in a manner in which we are doing, where you may have a constituent assembly, you may use the whole country as a constituent assembly, but there is a process we've already started, through the Guy Commission. As we've said, we've incorporated many good aspects of the Guy draft into this draft. So the reality is that we have to have elections. The reality is that we have to have a constitution that provides the fundamental framework for governance and the governance of people who govern you. And you will see there's a huge emphasis in this draft constitution as to how we should manage people or oversee people who will become your elected representatives. The Accountability and Transparency Commission, the Anti-Discrimination and Human Rights Commission, there are safeguards that have been built into it. For example, under the 1997 Constitution, you had a mechanism through, for example, if the Chief Justice, for example, was conducting him or herself in a manner unbecoming of Chief Justice, or, for example, had gone senile and was refusing to resign, and you had to have a medical board or tribunal appointed, which the President did on the recommendation of the Prime Minister. Now, under this draft, we're saying the report must be made public. Before, there was no such requirement. Similarly, in respect to the removal of the President, it was there in 1997 Constitution, but it was no requirement to make it public. We've said now you have to make it public. In the same way with the assets and liabilities, etc., public office holders. These are all new requirements. And they need to be put in place, they need to be implemented. So the gentleman's call, I think, and what he's saying is absolutely valid, because it's a political smokescreen. We have to prepare for elections. We have a new electoral system. For the first time in Fiji's history, 18-year-olds will be voting. It's very empowering for them, as they should have the right to vote. The young people need to have a right to vote from the age of 18. If they can get married, they can pay taxes. If they can get enlisted in the army or the police, if they commit a crime, we send them to the adult prison, they should have a right to vote. So that's the logic behind it. We have to prepare for the elections. We don't want dodgy elections, as we did in the EU report of the 2006 election shows, for example, that one of the seats in Dhakondrove had a voter turnout of 101%. How can you say that the elections were credible when the government of the day at that time had a majority of 2 seats? And one of the seats had a voter turnout of 101%. When one of the constituencies, the reconciliation of the ballot boxes was not done properly. So there are many problems. So we want to ensure that when the elections are held, when the results come out in 2014, that when we sit around the grog bowl and talk, we don't say, hey, these guys won through by crooking the system. We want people to say they want fair and square. It takes time to prepare for the elections. You need to meet this 30 September 2014 deadline.
Right. Well, we have another caller here online. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. Reginald here. Yes, I think we had cross-line with the other caller. And good afternoon to you, Attorney General.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, my problem is with the powers of the Prime Minister. At the moment, we have a good Prime Minister, and I think it may be the thinking that a good Prime Minister will be good all the time. Now, there comes a time when there's a strong, corrupt party with more than half of Parliament seats. How do you bring down this party without a coup? Number 2, under currents of racism, Itoke and Indo-Fijians is still around, and I suggest we have meetings, pocket meetings of eye-to-eye contact of Itoke and Indo-Fijians to see what is bothering them. Number 3 is why the president is not, the FMF, the military is not under the president. If he's going to assent to all the laws we put up to him and become ex, and therefore he's got power to assent, why can't he have the power to have the army under him? Why I say this, because you can have a corrupt prime minister who uses the army in a corrupt way, as we see it in other countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Well, the point there from our listener, Reginald.
Sure.
Would you like to comment?
I think it's a very valid point, but there's also the answers to that within the draft constitution itself. And I think this is what, I mean, these are very, very valid questions, and this is what we use these sessions to provide clarification on. If you see the draft constitution, for example, these sections relating, say, for example, if the Prime Minister recommends the appointment of an electoral commissioner or the appointment of Secretary General or, whatever position there is that the Prime Minister does, and generally these sort of high offices, they are appointed by the President on the recommendation of the Prime Minister. But if you read, I'm sure Reginald would have a copy of this, of the draft. If you can turn to section 147, subsection 5, it says, in the performance of his or her duties or functions or the exercise of his or her powers, a person to whom this part applies, and you've got a list of all those people that it applies to, is not subject to the direction or control by any person. So once they're appointed, they're on their own. They're not going to control. Just because the President has appointed him on the recommendation of the Prime Minister, it doesn't mean he or she kowtows to them. There's also a provision, section 148, is that you cannot even reduce their salary. Because, we have to safeguard for this, because just in case they might think, oh, if I make a wrong decision, they might reduce my salary, so I better not do that. There's also protection for that. But the additional protection that is provided in this constitution is the Accountability and Transparency Commission, which is under section 8 of the constitution. If I could ask you to turn to that. Sorry, this section, my apologies. Chapter 8, page 73. Now this commission, if you look at subsection 6, it says, in the performance of his functions, the exercise of his authority and powers, the Accountability and Transparency Commission shall be independent and shall not be the subject to the direction or control of any person or authority except by a court of law. Now what this commission does is essentially has the powers. It kind of incorporates the position of the ombudsman, but gives it more teeth.
Okay.
It has the ability to investigate complaints against the President, the Prime Minister, ministers, permanent secretaries, public office holders generally. It will also, under Code of Conduct rules. Now, the 1997 Constitution for Information provided a provision that said Parliament must make laws regarding Code of Conduct of public office holders, which includes declaration of assets and liabilities. All good Code of Conducts do that. Currently, the Solicitor General is working on that. We're about to implement it. In fact, we wanted to implement it last year. There's a lot of other emergency work that came along and drafting that had to be done. But this should be in place within 3 months. So even before we have elections, a code of conduct will be in place, in which you'll be able to go to the Commission and know exactly how much I have in my bank account, how much I earn, what assets I have, what assets my wife has, and my children have. I have only one child. Now, the point then is, you can go and see that. If in 6 months' time, which I have to update my information every 6 months, I suddenly have $1 million more in my account, the Commission will investigate me. And you will also know that I'm doing something funny. You want to have a break?
Yes, we shall be heading into a short break right now. We'll come back to the Code of Conduct and also your questions. Stay with us. You're on Speak Your Mind on Gold FM. Gold FM, Speak Your Mind. Welcome back to it. We have the Attorney General who's speaking about the draft constitution. And of course, your comments, feel free to call us up. We'll go right back to what we were talking about just before we headed into a break, the Code of Conduct, with just a few more clarifications with regards to this before we head right back to the calls.
So just to complete answering Reginald's queries, is the Accountability Transparency Commission obviously has the powers to investigate public office holders. Mm-hmm. It also has the responsibility of protecting people who may be whistleblowers. So the example that I've been using, if my PA Una sees that I get visited by a company quite a lot and they leave gifts for me all the time and they know my ministry is about to give a contract, she can go and dob me in. And they have a responsibility to protect her. So you have to answer Reginald's the query that if you have, for example, in the future a corrupt prime minister, etc., these are the mechanisms through which people can put a check on them. The last query he raised was the Commander-in-Chief. The logic behind that is that the Commander-in-Chief is a ceremonial role. Mm-hmm. The Commander is different to Commander-in-Chief. It's more of a ceremonial role The idea was to draw a connectivity between the elected Prime Minister and the RFMF, given our past history.
Yes.
Now, but the other issue is that he talked about the assenting of laws or assenting of bills. One of the differences that we've also put in this draft constitution is previously, if Parliament, for example, approved a bill, approved something to be made a law, which is called a bill, it cannot be made into law until the President signs it or assents to it. Now, what we've done is here to give primacy to the elected House, we've said the President must sign it, as opposed to having the option not to sign it. Must sign it. If the President does not sign within 7 days, it becomes law in any case. So that's just to answer his query in that respect. But, like I said, some people think that the Commander-in-Chief should be still the President. But please, express your views in respect of that.
All right. On that note, we shall head to the lines. A very good afternoon to you. Please state your name and where you're calling from.
Hello. Good day. Good day.
Hello.
Good afternoon. Yes, you're on Speak Your Mind.
Yeah, okay. My name is Anare. I'm calling from Suba. Yeah, a good afternoon to our chief guest today, Mr. Khaiyum.
Good afternoon.
Yeah. Bulubinaga.
Bula.
Yeah. Only two issues I would like to raise while citing the draft constitution. Is that on the page 33 on electoral division?
Yes.
On section 52. I've seen the number of members to be elected in Parliament.
Yes.
Okay, that is okay, the number of members, but can we include a representative from the youth to be part of the Member of Parliament, and also a disability person? Maybe you can deduct it from Central Division once it makes them 17 seat, and the Western Division from 16 to 15. Because the youth of today, they need to raise their voice in the Parliament. I guess they have the majority of people in Fiji, of the youth of today. And the same thing, and the second thing says that there is I didn't see this in your draft constitution. There is a declaration being adopted by the General Assembly. That's way back on the 2007, 13th of September. This in regards to the rights of the indigenous people. Okay. By this, I would like to comment that 144 countries, they have agreed to that, to have that declaration to be adopted. And those 144 countries, China and India are the ones that contributed a lot to have these rights to be adopted. And these two countries are our main donors, aid donors, at the moment. And 4 countries, they disagree. That is New Zealand, the U.S., Canada, and Australia. By saying this, in due respect of your draft constitution, is it possible that the rights of the indigenous people to be included in your preamble, okay, the introduction of this, by saying that if it's the recognition and commitment of this country or of this constitution to be also the indigenous people to be recognized in your draft constitution. That is the two main issues I would like to address in your talkback show today.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Very, very valid queries, and I think very good comments too. To answer the first question, what the gentleman is essentially saying is reserve seats. Reserve seats for the youth or reserve seats for the disabled persons. And as he rightly also pointed out, that majority of the people in Fiji are now younger people. In fact, there are some stats, there's some initial analysis that was done that the out of the registered voters, nearly 50%, if not more, of them are below the age of 37.
That's right.
Very, very huge majority. Now, if you see, that's the beauty of multi-member constituency. So if you look, for example, in the Central Division, there are 18 members to be elected from the Central Division. When you go to vote, you will tick for 18 people that you want in an open list system. In other words, you can choose people. You may choose not all 18 from one party. You may decide to choose 9 from one and 4 from another, and the balance from the other party. That's what you call the open list system. Yash guy wanted a closed list system where you just vote for the party. And they essentially decide who will go in. But in this one, you choose, and you can cross-vote, if you like, across the parties. Now, any political party that is formed, their objective is to maximize the number of seats they win, so they can form government. Now, a smart political party, and most of them are quite clever, the politicians, they will want to appeal, if they know that you've got 18 ticks that you can have, they will want to appeal or cross-appeal to as many people as possible. So if they know that there are people who will vote along gender lines, or women will vote for women, or there will be people who, for example, the youth will vote for the youth, they will automatically put candidates who come from that demographic. They will automatically put some youth leaders. They will automatically put some women leaders, whoever they are, and they will identify. So in that way, you will get a cross-section of people who will be fielded as candidates, and in that way, that can be addressed. Because the danger of having reserve seats is once you give reserve seats to one group, everybody else will start wanting for it, and we've already had reserve seats in Fiji, and as you've seen, it does not necessarily work. And the example that I always like to use is what the Prime Minister said. In the Baini Marama cabinet, for example, you do not have anybody of Rotuman descent in his cabinet. But the Rotuma has seen so much development, unprecedented development in the past 3 or 4 years. You don't necessarily need to have a person of Rotuman descent in the cabinet to have development take place there. The government just needs to be focused on that. And there's in the Bill of Rights, you have rights of disabled persons. So that can be addressed in any case. And you have socio-economic rights that are built into it too, into the Bill of Rights. Do you want to have a break?
We'll take a break now, but we'll come back to the second part of the question,
yeah.
Which of course deals with the protection of Itoke rights and the question relating to that. You're on Speak Your Mind on Gold FM. We'll be back with you shortly. Welcome back to Speak Your Mind on Gold FM. I'm Peceli, and with me this afternoon we have the Attorney General Aiyaz Sayed-Khaiyum, who's talking about the draft constitution. And earlier on we had just took a caller that also had a few concerns with the provisions to Itoke rights. And Attorney General, I'll leave you to comment.
Sure. I think the points you made, and as I mentioned before we went on the break in the news, was about the inclusion of socioeconomic rights. And in fact, I'm very glad that he raised the issues about those countries that are refusing to participate in this declaration regarding indigenous rights. We have Australia, New Zealand, USA, and Canada. And because if you look at those countries, that's where the most, many would argue, injustices took place against the indigenous people, but of course in South America too. For example, in Australia, when the Brits came in, they said it was terra nullius. In other words, the land was vacant, it was empty. So they took the land. Even though the Aborigines alive, they are living there, they said it was vacant, so there's no treaty signed, etc. And in fact, so much so that you had, for example, Tasmanian Aborigines were killed off. People used to go shooting Tasmanian Aborigines as a sport, and also Aborigines elsewhere. After church, they would go and shoot Tasmanian Aborigines.
Oh, quite horrific.
Very horrific. And so therefore, right up till 1967, they weren't even counted in the census of Australia. They had to amend their constitution to count them as human beings. Similarly, we can go on about that, but similarly in New Zealand, there was expropriation of land. Land was taken away, American Indians too, Canada to an extent. There are other parts also in South America. Now, it is from the experiences of such like experiences of indigenous people did this universal attention come to it, or the global attention come to it. Now, Fiji, of course, 91% of all the land in Fiji is Itoke land. That sort of type of alienation has not taken place. Now, if you look at most of the indigenous groups that have been part and parcel of this global movement, they are all groups of people who have, for example, been politically marginalized, have been economically marginalized, socially marginalized, and their lands have been arbitrarily taken away from them. Section 27 of the draft constitution talks about how no land can be arbitrarily taken away from you. Now, this obviously, there are three types of land in Fiji that we have. You have Itaukea land, that is 91% of all the land in Fiji is Itaukea land. And the balance of the land is what you call crown land or state land, and freehold land. So really, in terms of ownership, other than, of course, the state, you're talking about Itaukea or freehold land. So in the submissions we have received, we've said Section 27 protects that. But some people have said maybe, yes, okay, we agree with it being protected. However, maybe you need to spell it out. You need to actually say it. And we accept that. That's one of the concrete submissions that can be made, that we need to actually spell it out. But the intention is there, obviously, to protect it. But some people like, it actually mentioned specifically. But in law, we would argue that it is protected. Nonetheless, the other section, of course, is Section 26.3, where the unfair discrimination provision includes now culture. Even the Guy draft did not include culture. So in terms of preservation of culture, in terms of discrimination just because you follow a particular culture, that would be not allowed. Or preservation would be allowed because there is no unfair discrimination allowed regarding culture. So it's a much broader context. When you talk about indigenous rights, generally per se through the conventions, we say that that's being translated here in Section 26 and 27 regarding preservation of right and preservation of culture. But again, people have said, well, can you spell it out a bit more? And we would love people to make submissions on that.
I think that would be the gist of how these comments have been coming about.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so I think for those who are tuned in, making that submission to spell it out or to say that you need it explained further in the draft constitution, that could be a submission in itself.
And see, but the thing, Peceli, unfortunately, is, as we saw in Nasino the other night, people are basically standing up. Like this gentleman has made a submission. He's made a rational conversation about it. He said, look, there's certain conventions, can we have that protected, include? It's fine, great, make a submission. But you had people, former civil servants, SDL type, former SDL people, standing there saying, your rights are gone, they're finished. Please be constructive. If you think that they're not being addressed, ask if it's being addressed or not. And if you think there needs to be improved, make those suggestions. We urge you to make those submissions. That's the whole basis for these consultations we are having, rather than sort of trying to fearmonger and create some political mileage out of it.
Well, on that note, we have a caller here online. Good afternoon, sir.
Hello.
Yes, you're on Speak Your Mind. Please state your name and where you're calling from.
Thank you. This is Tui from Rewa. Thank you for Mr. Khaiyum for his explanations. He's sort of answering what I wanted to ask, that we make submissions. The concern we have, for me as indigenous person and landowner, I don't agree that the declaration doesn't apply to Fiji. It applies because for me as an indigenous person, I feel like I'm under pressure. Number one, the changes to the constitution, the removal of reserve seats for indigenous Fijians. A lot of these things are in the declaration, so that's why we would like it included in the constitution. And also, when you look at the 97 constitution, the removal of section 185 on the entrance legislation, including the Lands Act, Native Lands Act, the requirement there was any changes to that would be approved by 9 out of the 14 GCC nominees.
Not at all.
So that's all been removed. So, of course, the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People applies here because we are under pressure from these changes, which the way I see it, it's removing a lot of legislative provisions which protected our rights. So that's why I'm saying it applies here, and these things need to be looked at carefully. And the way these things have been removed, for example, the GCC, this is again a breach of that UNGRIP, done without consultation with the indigenous people, and a lot of these changes are done without consultation. And consultation starts from the bottom, from the village, the Tikina level, and it comes to Boshevanua and all this. And we need consultations with our lawyers. These things need to be carefully examined analyzed, and then put to the national level in a workshop, and then we discuss these things before we put it in the constitution. So this is what I'm suggesting. We need more time for this. And the reason for this is it's also for future security and stability. If these things are not addressed carefully now, it can be a source of future instability and insecurity, because these things will never die. For example, for me, I'm teaching my children their rights as indigenous people, their rights to the land, and the need to know the law to protect these rights. For example, by the removal of Section 185, Parliament it can change the Native Lands Act. That's very clear. Any Parliament can change it. When you remove the GCC nominees from the equation, any Parliament can change it. It's just open. So, you guys should, my request to you, please be clear in your explanations and look at the process again. Look at the process in terms of wider consultations. They need to come down to explain things carefully in the Fijian language, in the indigenous language. At the moment, everybody is overwhelmed with this information and explanations. So my plea, please don't rush this thing. Let's take it easy. Let's go community by community, and then we make the change. Of course, there are changes which need to be done, but let's do it carefully in a consultative way and in a truthful manner, because the way Kisoko and Raturala is explaining in Fijian, they are not explaining what I just said. It's like, in Fijian we call it Werumbiumbi. So we need full consultation, full legal analysis. We need the people from the UN Indigenous Rights Office in the UN to come here and advise us on these issues, and then it goes through that analytical process, that full consultation.
Thank you very much, sir. I'm sorry, we are running out of time. I'm going to give the AG a few more moments to
Sure.
answer your comments.
No, thank you, Tui, for your call. A couple of points I'd like to make. I'm not saying it's not necessarily applicable in Fiji. I was explaining how it actually started off and where it came from. Where did it get its impetus from? But, I think he needs to understand that notwithstanding the fact that you have the Native Lands Act, that was a entrenched law, that Native Lands Act Section 5 said that you cannot alienate, in other words, give up or convert Itauke land to freehold land. You could not do that. Despite that provision being an entrenched provision, the 2006 cabinet in June or July alienated Itauke land and helped convert it to freehold land. So even though it was a group right, a protected legislation, they still allowed that to happen. Now he's saying that now the Native Lands Act can be changed by a simple majority parliament. Absolutely not. That's why we put land ownership in the Bill of Rights. If you read the introduction to Bill of Rights, it says, this chapter binds Parliament, the judiciary, the executive branch of government at all levels. That includes cabinet. It includes the DO, who's going to decide on digging a drain somewhere. And it also says, those persons performing the functions of any public office. It also then says, laws made and administrative and judicial actions taken after the commencement of this constitution are subject to the provision of this chapter. There's two things I want to make to him. And Native Lands Act said you cannot convert it to freehold. It was converted to freehold. The Garase government people and their supporters are now saying, well, it was allowed in law to do it. Yes, what they did was they converted Itauke to crown land. Then they converted the same land that was now crown land to freehold. There was a loophole there. And they used that loophole, knowing full well that the intention of converting it from Itauke to crown land was to permanently alienate it to freehold. Knowing that, and they did one cabinet decision. Now, it is quite emphatically clear that the Native Lands Act, NLA, said you can't do that. Yet they went ahead and used this loophole. Prime Minister Benny Marama has stopped that loophole. We made an amendment to the law that if any Itauke land is, for example, used by the state for public purpose, like, they want to convert some land to build a sewage treatment plant, for the community. If that land is no longer required, it cannot sit in the state land bank. it must be given back to the Tauke landowners. So the test here is, if you have these land rights included in the Bill of Rights, and as I said, the Bill of Rights is the heart of the Constitution, and every single decision of government, not just Parliament, not just Cabinet, but even at the administrative level, all civil servants, any administrative action needs to have taken into account the Bill of Rights. Then your rights are even more protected. And no Parliament can ever do that. And in fact, to amend this now, you need 3/4. 3/4 to amend this Constitution. Before you had 2/3. So the point is, and it's not just 3/4 of Parliament, it's 3/4 of the members of the voters. So you, the indigenous people who are concerned about it, will have a vote in it also. So that's an additional protection. So I think that needs to be understood, and perhaps, I take his point in terms of maybe the explanation needs to be done a lot better and in the vernacular, but this is what we've been doing. For example, the session we had in Kandavu yesterday, it was done in the vernacular. People could ask questions in the vernacular. But please be assured that what is actually happening in this draft constitution, you in fact are getting unprecedented protection.
On that note, thank you very much, Attorney General, sir. We've unfortunately run out of time this afternoon. Once again, thank you for all your comments, and you're most welcome to still call us up and also submit, or just contact the Attorney General's office and attend these draft constitution consultations with your submission. On that note, we bid you adieu, and we'll talk to you again on the next Speak Your Mind next week.